Today we are going to be doing 13 techniques. This is kind of a basics, washes, different techniques to get us started in watercolor. And the first thing we're going to need to do is tape down our paper. We always start by taping down our paper because it gets all warped. So you need to check to make sure that you've got it the right side up. So we want to find the texture, also called the tooth in the paper. And you can usually feel it, and sometimes if you can't feel it, you can kind of twist it around and you can kind of see that texture. So I know that this is the right way up. So I'm gonna lay that down and I'm gonna take my painter's tape and I am going to tape all the way around my paper. And I'm gonna do half on the paper. You can kind of see through it a little bit. Half on the board. I try to get it as even as possible because this allows for cleaner lines in the end. And then we'll do the sides. We do not want to just do corners. If you do just corners or just little pieces, the tape it'll look messy once you pull it off. But also, whoop, that might be a little bit long, that's okay. It will start to lift up. So I was a little bit generous with my tape, that's okay. So now that everything's taped down, what I want to do is I want to divide my paper into 10 sections. This is going to be 13 techniques, but I'm going to layer over for some of them. So I first want to divide my paper in half. So I'll take another piece of tape. And if you want to, you can measure exactly, but I'm going to just guess at it. That looks pretty good. And then I need to divide this into 5 pieces with 4 different pieces of tape. And I'm going to guess at this too. That's not so bad. Pretty even. Okay, that's step 1, is getting all of those 10 boxes separated. Okay, you are going to need a plethora of materials for this next piece, but our most important materials we'll need are our 2 cups of water, 1 dirty water container, 1 clean water container. We will need a few brushes. I'm going to use a large flat brush. You will need a fan brush. I've got all kinds of materials all around. A palette of your watercolors. You shouldn't need tape anymore. And I'll need rubber cement, isopropyl alcohol, something to write with. A pencil or pen is just fine. Some bubbles. Something to scratch with, like a toothpick. I'm going to use the end of this pen. And in the end, we're going to be turning this into a booklet. So we're going to need a hole punch and some yarn. And I've got a straw and some bubbles. So we're going to get started. Okay, first things first, we're going to talk about mixing your paint. So if you've never mixed your paint before for watercolors, you are going to need several different cups. And what I want to stress is that the colors that come straight out of the pans, these cakes, they are not natural looking colors. These are your typical primary, secondary, tertiary colors. You've got your red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, brown, and black. There is no white with watercolor. We do have some kind of white, but it's more of a gouache, which is a mix between acrylic and watercolor. In watercolor, you're going to want to leave white behind, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on the paper. So you want to leave white behind. You're not going to want to add. Watercolor is a lot flatter than acrylic because you can't layer all those paints. So we want to plan ahead. But when you pull colors directly out of these palettes, the colors aren't as natural. So I like to mix at least 2 different colors to come up with a more natural color. So mixing color is important. So we always want to start with loading our brush. Let's load our brush from this clean water. And loading the brush is just filling your brush with water and bringing it to your palette so you can see that it's sitting in there. Now, I wouldn't do this usually on top of my paper, but just for filming purposes. So you can see I'm setting it here. You're not gonna wanna mix your colors on top of your paper because you'll splash it everywhere, but just for this demonstration. Let's pick 2 colors. It can be any color, 2 colors that you wouldn't necessarily put together. Here, since this is out of its container, I'm just gonna go like this. I'm gonna mix some yellow. I'm gonna get the cake wet. The cake is the color inside of the pan. There we go. And now I'm gonna clean my brush with my dirty water because I'm gonna dip into a new color. So let's dip into green. We'll do a yellow-green color. Now there is no math on mixing the color. It's sort of just a guess. What I recommend is having a spare piece of watercolor paper on the side so that way you can test the color to make sure it's how you want it to look, because it's not like mixing. You need 30% color and 70% water, etc., etc. It's more of a mixing until it feels right. So I always keep a paper towel on the side for taking some water off of my brush. We don't need this much water. Okay, we are going to, look at that. We got some color drops, but that's okay. Paper towel, we'll take that off. I'm gonna move this off of the paper of the board. Let's put this on the side here. Okay, keep these in the shot. And we are going to fill our first box. And the first box is called a flat wash. So you're gonna label it flat wash, FLATWASH. So a flat wash is a wash that looks flat. You don't want any variations in value. Look at this, I'm already making a mess. You just want it to be one flat color, like a piece of construction paper. So I'm gonna load my brush with color. And the goal is to cover this entire area in one stroke. Well, not one stroke, but one stroke of color, really. We don't wanna have to get more color from our palette. We want to just go ahead and do the one. And if you have these spots where the water is pooling, I try to push it off the paper if you can. Here we go. And this will dry a little bit different. So I'm going to wait for that to dry. We'll see how it goes. If need be, we can do another layer once it's dry. This is wet on dry, that is glazing. So let's clean our brush, and we are going to move on to step 2, or box 2, which is called a graduated wash. Like you're graduating. So that is Graduated, wash, graduated wash. And for this one, we are going to do a wash that goes from dark to light. And I'm just going to use the same green that I have since I still have quite a bit of it. This one is a little bit more technical than the flat wash and can be difficult at first. So if it's tough, this is just the first time doing it. You can continue practicing it. It'll be okay. So we're going to load the brush with the color. Ooh, and I don't have a ton of color yet. Look at that disappear. Color left, it's like a sponge. Okay, and I'm going to paint up top. And the goal is to get it from the darkest to the lightest. So I'm going to dab some of my color off in the water and then dab it off in the paper towel. And I'm gonna drag the color that's already there downwards. And I'm going to take some of the color off in the water, dab on my paper towel, and then drag this color down. So I'm not adding more color, I'm moving the color. I'm diluting the color and moving it downwards. So you have a flat wash and a graduated wash. This graduated wash goes from dark to light. Our third box will be wet on wet. And what this is doing wet color on wet color. And this gives us a more of like a tie-dye look, as opposed to something you'd see with acrylic paint, which is more precise. This is very organic and free-flowing. So I'm gonna need two different colors for this one. And to keep with my color scheme, I'm going to, so you don't wanna use your dirty water when mixing a color, but since I wanna keep this same color, this green and yellow, I'm going to just dip right back into that green. That'll be my base. I wanna get a color scheme going on. We'll clean this off, dip in some clean water, and let's go back into that yellow. Ooh, that's actually quite a bit more yellow than it was previously. That's okay, let's clean that brush. Now I'm gonna mix the second color. Let's do something that kind of goes together, but it's not the same. All right, now I'm gonna do a flat wash for this section. And the trick to this is making sure that the box is still wet when you dip in with the next color. And this is okay if it's not completely flat because I'm going to be adding more color anyway. So once you add your color, you'll see it kind of disperses. It's not like painting with, again, acrylic paint or like drawing with a Sharpie or a pen. It sort of bleeds. And I'm just gonna do some spots. Watch how it spreads out like tie-dye. You could even go back over and drop some water on top. And I'm making a mess in other boxes, but you can take a paper towel and dab some of that mess away. And you'll see you get a very loose tie-dye-ish look. It kind of looks like it might be lily pads on the water. While this dries, we are going to move on to the next one. This one is rubber cement. And this is gonna take some time to dry, but we can get started with it. Rubber cement is great as a mask. And what that means is when you put it down and you let it dry, you can paint on top and then peel the rubber cement away and it leaves white behind. This is great if you want to do some really bright highlights, especially if you do like a galaxy scene or something with a really dark background. You can mask it all out, paint a background with a flat wash so you don't have to paint around your shapes. And then when it's dry, you can peel it off and leave it behind. So let's do that. I'm gonna do, ooh, this rubber cement is very runny. Ooh, goopy. Let's do a circle shape. Now this much is going to take a long time to dry. That's okay. You'll have to come back to it to another day, so will I. I will just do a flat wash on top of it when it's completely dry, and then I'll rub that rubber cement off. Next up, we're gonna do salt. And salt is exactly what it sounds like. Whoop. Okay, no, down. Next up, we're gonna do salt. And salt is exactly what it sounds like. We're gonna put some iodized salt on top of watercolor. And the trick to this is making sure that the watercolor stays wet when you put salt on it. Once you finish with it, let the water dry. It leaves behind a texture, kind of looks like when ice freezes on a window. So why don't we go ahead and make a nice dark blue for that. All right, let's do a wash and sprinkle some salt. That is not as dark as I intended. Okay, hello. I've got a guest. She's trying to drink my clean watercolor water. That's fine. And we're gonna take some salt. And we're gonna sprinkle some on top. And I'm gonna leave that there. And the salt is gonna soak up water. And once it's completely dry, we can rub the salt off. Go, oh, you silly cat. Next up, we're gonna do sgraffito. And sgraffito is Italian for scratch. So let's write sgraffito. So you can use a toothpick, anything sharp really to scratch as long as you don't rip the paper. I'm gonna use the end of this pen and I'm gonna draw an image. Let's see if it can be revealed. If you don't see the impression underneath, then you did not press hard enough. Let's mix these colors, see what happens. And let's add a little bit more. All right, let's see. if we can reveal our picture. Can we see it? It's our guest. There we go. And the watercolor sits inside of the divots and makes it a little bit darker, so it's kind of like a hidden image that pops out. Next up, we are doing rubbing alcohol or isopropyl alcohol. Rubbing alcohol is easier. Rubbing alcohol is easier to say. So we are going to use this isopropyl alcohol after we're done laying down a wash. So let's go ahead and mix a color. Let's do a little something different. All right, so we're going to have to paint quickly because we need to make sure it's wet, just like the salt and the wet on wet while we use the isopropyl alcohol. So let me load this brush. And then you can use the end of your brush to dip into the isopropyl alcohol and then drop it on the paper. And I like to say that the watercolor is afraid of this alcohol and kind of runs away. It spreads. Almost looks like germs. Looks very scientific. Next up, we are going to do lifting off. And you will need a dry paper towel for that. So I'm going to rip a scrap and I'm going to scrunch it. And we are going to do a sky for this one, because I like to use the lifting off technique for clouds. That's kind of my main motive when using it. So let's make a nice sky. Load your brush. And while the paint is still wet on the paper, I'm gonna take your paper towel. Oh, let me clean this up a little bit more. The paper is starting to bubble up. This is a good thing we have paper towel. And we're gonna dab the color away. Lifting off is also good if you drop color or not happy with your color. You can add some clean water and lift it off with a paper towel. But you also can do some really nice clouds. Next up, we're gonna do a graduated color blend here. Just like the graduated wash from dark to light, we're gonna do the same thing, but we're gonna do two and blend into each other. Graduated color blend. So we're gonna need to mix two colors. They don't have to be next to each other on the color wheel or analogous, but they can be. And that's what I'm gonna do to keep with my color palette. Let me go ahead and just get started doing one. I'm gonna let it dry a little bit before I go ahead and do the other one. All right, subtle blend, but we're gonna wait for this to dry. We'll come back and we'll do the other side. While we wait for that to dry, let's go ahead and jump into a dry brush. Now, a dry brush, we need to make sure our brush is dry, and I like to use a fan brush for this technique. This is how I do foliage and grass. We will need the cake itself to be wet, so let's wet the color directly. I'm gonna go ahead and just dip straight into the cake. I know I said not to, but here we are. I'm gonna make sure that, oh goodness, look at me making a mess. The green is wet. I'm going to dip the ends of my fan brush in. I don't want to wet the brush. I want this just the wet paint on the ends. And then I'm going to do short brush strokes. And this creates a nice grass texture. Feel free to fill your space. I'm going to stop there. And you don't want to leave your brushes in here for too long or else they start to get warped. So I'm going to take that out. And we're going to move on to spattering. As you see, we filled all 10 spots. So we're going to jump back up to flat wash and do flat wash plus spattering. And if I thought ahead, I would have put this up a little higher so there was room, but that's okay. And this is just like splattering, spattering, splatter paint. There's two ways I can do this. One is I can tap on my brush. Whoop, and look at that. That's okay. I can tap on my brush, but as you see, a little messy. Look at that, fling off in the wrong area. Or you can pull your bristles back and shoot them onto the paper. This is good for stars. Yes, it still makes a mess. It's a little bit easier to control. This is the way I prefer to do it. It's okay if it bleeds into your other sections. We are just gonna lift off this extra paint. Next up, we're gonna do stamping. So since we already shot some color here, let's do plus stamping. And this involves stamping color. Kind of like your dry brush, I like to dip directly into the pans. You can also mix your colors. I'll show that as well. I would take a damp sponge or paper towel. It can be dry as well. I'm gonna make mine a little bit damp. I'm gonna crumple it up and let's dip it into the cake or the pan. And this is going to leave texture behind. That'll do, and the whole space does not need to be filled. Next up, we've got straw blowing. Let's jump down to our Sgraffito. And it looks like our graduated color blend is dry, so we'll come back to that as well. And the trick with straw blowing is you need to make sure that when you place the color on top that there is a bubble of water, that you can tell that it is not just soaking into the paper. There should be a little excess, ooh, like this, so you can blow it around. And some artists will use this to create branches and trees. I could use this to make some whiskers for my cat. I'm already blowing the wrong way though. That'll do. Okay, so let's go back with graduated color blend, and we're gonna do this a little bit different. Ooh, look at my stack of wet paper towels. I'm trying to make sure they don't sit on the desk, but here we are. Okay, we're gonna start the other way. Instead of dipping directly in water, I'm just gonna dry it off and drag it. If you use too much water, you'll start to pull the color, and you'll see that it starts to blend together. This side should go much quicker. There we go. And we've actually got two more we're going to do. And that is bubbles and glazing. So we are going to do some bubbles first. So let's do dry brush plus bubbles. And this isn't something you'll typically do, but it's fun to experiment with different watercolor techniques. So this is bubbles, kids bubbles with some food coloring inside. And I'm going to blow it directly onto my canvas. You have to be careful with the bubbles because they do stain. Ooh, the watercolor cleans up easy. Food coloring stains. And that's fine. I've seen students use this to do different projects before. It's not used often, but when it's done well, it's very cool. And we have two left, technically. We have glazing and then rubber cement. My rubber cement has not dried yet, so I will not be able to finish that one off right now. So let's do rubbing alcohol plus glazing. And all glazing is painting wet on dry. So unlike wet on wet, which is still drying because it's sitting in pools, I'm going to paint wet on dry. This is completely dry now, so I'm going to put a wet layer on top of it. So just to use up some of the color that I already have, I'm just going to load up my brush with these colors. And what this does is it can change the color that you have down. You can layer different colors. You can make it darker. You can change it. It can be very, very handy. Look at that layering. There we go. There we go. That's all glazing is wet on dry. And that last step, we're gonna need to wait for that rubber cement to dry. As of now, this is gonna take overnight. So the salt is almost dry. It takes a little longer to dry because that salt is still soaking up, but you can already see some of that texture coming through. So once this is dry, I'm going to take off all my tape and I'm going to cut it into pieces, hole punch the corners and tie it together. But I can't do this till this dries overnight. So that is the first step to finishing this piece.